I think what I hope to achieve was just raise a few of these questions and have a conversation about them. I'm curious, and I like speaking to other curious people, particularly people who disagree with me.
Welcome to This Isn't Working, the podcast for employers and employees who think it's time to talk about the failings of workplace culture and how we can do better. I'm your host, Tanya de Grunwald, an HR commentator who's watching, listening, and hopefully asking the right questions. Okay, let's get this working.
Okay, welcome, Pamela Dow. How are you? Lovely to see you.
Good morning. I'm very well.
Excellent. Thank you so much for joining us today. Now, our paths crossed a few months ago, and we've had this booked in for maybe since sort of October time. And it's turned out to be excellent timing, as you're proving to be quite the troublemaker, which I have to say is usually my role. So I guess I should be thanking you for taking the heat off me a little bit. How does that feel to you?
It feels fine. I've been looking forward to this conversation.
Okay, great. Our audience might recognise your name for a couple of different reasons. So firstly, you chaired the government's Inclusion at Work panel, which produced a report that was published in April 2024. And then more recently, in November, you wrote a long piece for the new Statesman, which was titled HR Britain, How Human Resources Captured the Nation. And the subtitle was, Is HR the Force Holding Back Our Economy? And I think people have been sort of asking for some time in the HR world, who is Pamela Dow and what does she know about HR? Which is a fair question. So you've sort of come sort of almost from nowhere. From their perspective. I know you've had a long career, but it's a fair question. So can you just tell us a little bit about what is your background, and then we can get into what your expertise and interest is within HR?
Of course. And as I said, Tanya, I've been looking forward to this conversation, and it really has been a pleasure getting to know you over the last year. And I'm really grateful to you for engaging so thoughtfully with first the Inclusion at Work panel report, as you mentioned, and then, promoting it to your listeners and your network. But then more recently helping to broaden and deepen this conversation about human resources, about HR in such a thoughtful way. In answer to your question, I've always been absolutely honest about my trespasser status in HR. I'll give you a very quick CV. I started off as a graduate trainee in the private sector consultancy in lobbying and government relations. I worked in public affairs and policy throughout my 20s. And then just at the end of my 20s and the noughties, I got a job in the civil service in the Department for Education. And that's when I first started managing bigger teams of 10, 20, 70 people and coming into contact with, as people do in large bureaucracies, whether private or public sector, with HR business partners and HR policies for recruiting, for performance managing, for training. And I did a number of jobs in and around government, in education, in justice, including in a prison, in a big charity provider to government. And all of those in some way were connected to building teams, training teams, incentivizing teams. So again, I was still a sort of anthropologist or explorer in HR country. But in 2020, I went back into the civil service after having been out for a while to the Cabinet Office, which for those who don't know, is a sort of slightly strange government department because it doesn't actually run anything like, the Ministry of Justice runs prisons or the Department for Work and Pensions runs job centres. The Cabinet Office is a sort of facilitator department, but it's where all the functions of government sit. And I had a new role working within civil service HR, so right in the belly of the beast. I was working to the chief people officer at the time, but I was leading a very new priority, but both a political priority and a sort of a permanent civil service priority to improve civil service skills, defined very broadly. Now, it's worth just saying two things at that point. One, and I do want to make this point really clear, many of the people, career HR professionals who I worked with in that role, on my own team and across Whitehall, were some of the most committed, able, thoughtful, good-humoured, true public servants I've ever met. I'm delighted to count many of them still my friends. I learned far more from them than they learnt from me, and I owe them a great deal. And secondly, it's worth saying that period, 2020 to 2022, in civil service HR in the Cabinet Office, was not a typical period to experience. The Cabinet Office itself was a dysfunctional and unhappy entity. And that's not just me saying it. The staff survey results from those years are in the public domain. It was a difficult time for the leaders and managers of that department. And all of us in the leadership and management roles have to share responsibility for that. But also CSHR, civil service HR, was really at a sort of nadir of its existence as well. The concept of a central strategic function for HR across government always looked a bit better on paper than it did in practice. And the best way to sort of illustrate that is that the role of chief people officer in government, which you would, people in your network, in your world will understand what a CPO is. In the Cabinet Office, it doesn't actually lead HR in the Cabinet Office, but nor does it lead HR in any of the other departments. It's a sort of nominal role. So the actual senior leaders of HR in the big employer departments, in work and pensions, in the Home Office, in Revenue and Customs, they were all vastly more powerful and influential, incredibly impressive people. Again, some of the most impressive people I've worked with. So it was a strange place to be at a strange time. And everything I say, all my insights, need to be viewed in that framework. It gave me a sort of technicolor, high definition, accelerated view of some of the worst excesses of HR, with bad incentives. That said, we did make some progress in improving training and skills. We established a leadership college, the first ever curriculum for the civil service, a campus for learning. We quietly got rid of, more than 400 commercial courses which were irrelevant and unproven. And that was long before Jacob Rees-Mogg and Esther McVeigh's short stints as ministers. But does that it sort of establishes my credentials, I hope, but it also kind of frames my insights.
Okay, so is it fair to say that it sounds like most of your expertise is within the civil service? So, and yet the scope of the New Statesman article was into the private sector as well. Do you have, was it a fair criticism to say that you didn't know as much about the private sector, and therefore some of what was written maybe wasn't as applicable as people might want it to be?
I think that's completely fair. I mean, any sort of response to the article is fair in a sense. I thought I was sort of following a kind of scientific method of you spot an interesting outlier, a set of statistics or set of insights. You have a hypothesis, you test them, you put them out there, you seek and welcome people's own explanations and insights. So I think that's absolutely true. I mean, I suppose two things. When I started thinking and talking about what I was seeing, with friends, with former colleagues, I've got quite a big network from my Z-shaped career. I think one of the prompts for writing what I did and talking about what I did was just how many people in the private sector would sort of lean in when I mentioned it, when I was sort of going, this sort of crazy thing I've noticed, and people would sort of say, that's totally a thing. It's totally a thing in my sector as well. So that was sort of one kind of incentive, I suppose, for me to explore further. And then, this is obviously after the fact, but the response to the article has almost been, as you mentioned, a layer of astonishment in itself of my inbox and WhatsApps. So it just became flooded with people's tales of woe, recognition. I feel seen. And that was from, every sector. Clearly something's happening in universities with HR because loads of people got in touch. And also, like, weirdly, in sort of startups and the private sector, that we've got this image of being, they're nimble. They don't need to, have all these sort of, central functions. But there's definitely a recognition from there as well. So there's definitely something interesting going on.
And did you actually pitch it to the New Statesman?
No, I didn't.
One of the kind of allegations was that it was sort of politically motivated and you were some kind of right-wing plant or something.
They suggested I write it and commissioned it. So I'm not partisan. For full transparency, I've only ever been a member of a political party once, and it was the Labour Party in 2005. I'm honestly quite a private person. This isn't a sort of pitch for me to get into commentating. I just, wanted to talk about something that interests me, and I'm really enjoying talking about it to people who are equally sort of curious.
Hi, everybody. Just a quick reminder to like and subscribe. It really helps new people to find us, and it means I can keep enticing great guests to join us. Also, a special message for HR professionals who are listening. If you enjoyed the podcast and would value speaking to other employers who share an appetite for robust discussion, do get in touch with me via LinkedIn. We'll be launching a new community soon, so this is your chance to shape those plans. Okay, I'll let you get back to the episode. Lots of people who are listening will have read the piece, but for anyone who didn't, could you just maybe outline a few of the main points in it And why did you feel that it was so important to touch on those points?
A lot of people were pointing out that Britain was an outlier among similar countries on our lack of growth, our economic sluggishness, our low productivity. It's a problem in all developed, weird, do you know that acronym, Western, educated, industrial, rich, developed? It's a problem in all weird countries. But Britain's got it bad. So there was a sort of series of really good analysis, like the Foundations essay that I cite in the piece by Sam Bowman and Ben Southwood and Samuel Hughes. And they explain a bit further some the causal factors behind some of these barriers. Britain's planning and legal framework make us an outlier in sort of length of time it takes to build infrastructure, for example. And I'd, hit upon this other fact that made us an outlier. And I thought that it was worth making the case because coupled with that sort of, evidential, statistical insight was my empirical kind of experience of seeing just how many kind of perverse incentives there were around the way people were incentivizing, training, recruiting, performance managing people. So the sort of article covers the volume of HR jobs, the trends over the last couple of decades. They've been growing steadily in most Western countries, but Britain is second from the top. The British Labour Force survey shows a steady 83% increase. The other thing that's particular about Britain is the volume and rate of graduates for whom HR is a first destination job. There is a sort of guild-like kind of professional credentialism in the UK, which is the dominance of the sort of membership associations is again, I need to find out more about other countries, but it is a particular thing in the UK. And the history of the, CIPD, their remit, their status in government is an interesting thing to highlight. And then, the seeming absence of any correlation with all these trends and a positive impact. Our workforce, as I say in the article, if you could show, employment tribunals going down, people's morale and, meta staff surveys going up, more contentment, more higher productivity, you might say, well, that's really good. We're clearly doing the right things in investing in our people. But if anything, there was an inverse correlation. So that was the main argument.
It's a really good question to ask about what sort of people tend to be attracted to what sort of careers. And I think we see that within DEI as well as HR more broadly. There weren't quite so many jobs in these industries. Where would these people go? And it's worth thinking, are they more, they tend to be politically, personally, quite left-leaning.
Yeah, there's two things. First of all, I think I quote him in the article, that Charlie Munger phrase of show me the behaviour and I'll show you the incentives. People aren't mad. People do things that are rational in their own constraints. So if a role is going to give you high status, allow you to think about social justice and have an influence on social justice debates and be working on something very deep to your sense of identity and value, clearly you're going to be attracted to those jobs. And increasingly, the HR's reputation in the, say, 70s and 80s is very different from its reputation now. So you can see why it's attractive to sort of more campaigning and mission-seeking individuals. So that's the first thing. And I think the other thing is that there's a lot of roles, not just HR, because I used to think about this in terms of how we were advertising the fast stream, the civil service fast stream. Completely understandably, you go to a whizzy marketing agency in Soho and you say, how do we do the milk round for the fast stream? And they come up with the kind of the key insight. This group of graduates want to say work on climate change. They want to work on international aid. So the adverts, the marketing for the fast stream sort of gradually shifted more towards that. But of course, if you're an Armstrong Memorandum civil servant, the Armstrong Memorandum is a famous sort of a very short but pithy and excellent description of the relationship of the civil service to the government, that says you serve the government of the day. That's what your job is. And if you want to do that, you might be better off in an NGO than in the civil service. So I think, that was a mistake to position the FAS stream as that. And I wonder whether there's a similar thing happening with HR, that actually, I've listened to many of your podcasts, and, Neil from Seven, it's Neil from Seven, isn't it?
Yeah,
he's absolutely, you just, what a great guy and what a brilliant sort of leader and manager to work with. But you can imagine him speaking to, junior colleagues and saying, actually, HR at my level, if this is where you want to make your career, you need to be pretty ruthless about business objectives. You might have to have some really hard conversations. If what you really like doing is, helping individuals self-actualize, this might not be the place for you, because we're a business function.
What did you make of the backlash to the piece, especially from the HR world? I mean, were you surprised that that the CIPD, in fact, the Chartered Institute of Personnel Development, seemed to be suggesting that it was somehow politically motivated? Or Peter Cheese, who's the CEO, actually wrote online something on LinkedIn which suggested that. Were you surprised by the response?
I think what I hope to achieve was just raise a few of these questions and have a conversation about them. I'm curious, and I like speaking to other curious people, particularly people who disagree with me. One analysis is that the HR movement are filling a vacuum that's been left by senior leaders. So it is the head of organisations who should be giving direction on the people strategy. The people strategy shouldn't be a thing owned by HR. It's a core leadership thing. So I think another thing I wanted to achieve was to stop this sort of slight slopey shoulders of, this is a people issue, or we need a policy on people. Or we've got some redundancies to do, so we need HR to lead on it. Well, I'm afraid that is a dereliction of duty of kind of the executive teams more generally. So those are the things I wanted to expose with the article and get a debate get a debate going. So I think it did achieve that. And it's funny because I met Peter Cheese from CIPD during the Inclusion at Work panel, and we had a really good conversation about that. And I maybe I've got to do some self-questioning myself. Should I have talked to him about it before the article? It didn't cross my mind, but I probably should. I'd like to talk to him about it still. A lot of people talked about employment law. And I think, if I am going to think and write more about this, which I hope to, really understanding what's driving, the sort of chilling effect of employment tribunals or some of the things that are consequences of the Equality Act, that's a really important thing to understand, because, a lot of people who've been working in HR for many decades have said that's the real driver for behaviour. And then there's a sort of, is this actually about human resources, or is it just a wider set of trends in the sort of sprawl of corporate functions generally? And that's something to think about as well. But yeah, I was I would like to engage further with people like Peter. And as I say, there is a really interesting history of the CIPD to be written, and sort of analogies with other organisations that are trying to be a combination of trade union plus membership association plus lobby group. That's a difficult balance to tread, isn't it?
Yeah.
One of the things that made me curious was, so when I first joined the Cabinet Office, those of us who didn't have an HR background were being encouraged to do this accelerated status. So the accelerated status took the form of about an hour and a half of me online. And then at the end of this, I got an email from CIPD saying, great, you've passed. You can now be a chartered fellow of the CIPD. That'll be £350 a year. And then it made me think, okay, so a lot of people are using CIPD letters after their name, and the government departments are paying for that. So I did a bit of sort of back of the fag packet kind of sums. You're looking at £5 to £10 million going a year from that's just central government to the CIPD. Now, in the grand scale of government funding, it's not an enormous sum of money, but it is a kind of monopoly. And it is not in other things, other entities, organisations, training organisations that get government money. They have to compete for it. They have to go through procurement. They have to show impact. They have to show causality between the thing they're providing and the outcome. And none of that's happening in the case of government paying for people to have letters after their name. And in fact, the benefit is often to the individual rather than the organisation. With a legal qualification or accountancy qualification, I think we've reached a kind of common acceptance with those professions that there is a greater good in those professions having standard, objective, accessible measures of impact and knowledge and skills. And I don't think we have quite got there with HR. Someone should write a history of the CIPD, because it is genuinely fascinating, the sort of where it came from with sort of the Cadbury, and then all the different transitions to now being as I say, this sort of hybrid between a trade association and a membership body and a training provider and some aspects of a campaigning union. And as you know, going back to the Inclusion at Work panel, some of the policy and guidance of that organisation, and they are a very influential one, around interpreting equality law was incorrect, and that's not great.
Okay. I'd really love to talk a little bit more about the civil service itself, looking at the question, is the civil service working, or what isn't working in the civil service, given the name of this podcast? Can I just start, probably should have done this earlier, but can I just start by defining civil service? Are we talking here about the sort of government departments in kind of Whitehall, or are we talking about more broadly across kind of public sector jobs as such?
Sure. I will just say here, and I know I've said it already, but I'm going to say it again. I had a really long and wonderful career in the civil service. I was, when I was growing up in East Riding of Yorkshire, I had no idea that a sort of what the civil service was. I just knew that a lot of the people who were on Mastermind, that was their job. I didn't know what it was. My parents didn't know any. I didn't apply to the fast stream because I thought, when I finally kind of found out that you could become a graduate trainee in the civil service, its reputation then back in the kind of late 90s was, it was quite posh, and you need to have done a gap year in India or speak 5 languages. It was a very, high status career. And I just didn't think I'd get in. And it's changed for the good. So, and I worked with some of the most brilliant people in it throughout my career. So this is all by way of saying that all of my critique insights, such as they are, into the civil service comes from a place of deep love. I think if you really love something, you should tell hard truths, because I really, really care about the civil service. I care about impartial, high quality institutions, and I think the civil service is a bit fragile at the moment. You asked about what it was, the definition of it. So at the moment, I think it's about 480,000, just under half a million people, and that is all the main government departments and their sort of immediate kind of frontline agencies. So the big departments always surprises people, because you think, well, education, that must be a massive department, and it isn't actually, because the education department doesn't directly employ teachers. The Ministry of Justice directly employs prison officers. The Department for Work and Pensions directly employs people in job centres. His Majesty's Revenue and Customs, HMRC, directly employs, people who deal with taxis. So those are the big 5 departments. The Home Office directly employs, Border Force, caseworkers in Home Office. So it's the machinery of state.
Okay, so we're generally going to be talking fairly generally, I think, in this conversation. So would you have a view on, kind of from an organisational perspective, is it effective? Is it value for money? How well is it working, I guess, more broadly, in the numbers out of 10?
Well, look, I always like the mantra "show, don't tell." So here are just some illustrative figures. So public sector productivity is below 1997 levels. The Office for National Statistics November report, so last year November, on productivity, on quarter 2 productivity of last year is 1.2% lower than quarter 1. It's 8.6% lower than quarter 4. And obviously, people can have a discussion about whether the Office of National Statistics kind of measure of productivity is the right one. But, it's the one we use. It's not a bad proxy. for whether whether the sort of inputs into a sector are kind of value for money. The civil service salary costs are up from 11.4 billion in 2013 to 16.6 billion in 2022. But the sort of sadness of that is that it is a result of pay freezes. So because people can't see their salary increase within their role, they're moving around to get promoted. So we've seen the IFG, the Institute for Government, did a really good report on that at the end of last year. So we've basically got people we're paying a bigger salary envelope for less happy people because their salary's not individually improved without getting promoted. And because promotions are happening a lot earlier in the career and after sort of fewer layers of experience, we've got less expert and less experienced people. So all those things, we're paying more money for more grumpy, less experienced people. That's bad.
Yeah, that doesn't sound great, I have to say. I mean, I've always thought that though with civil servants that, my path hasn't crossed that many times, but I've always thought there was a sense of moving around from department to department, and no one, it was quite rare to find someone that had been in a particular department for a long time and who had any experience actually working in that world, having a proper job in that world, if you like. So, and it almost seemed to me like people were sort of using it as a sort of merry-go-round for them just to do, I'll do a bit of culture, I'll do a bit of work, I'll do a bit of, justice, I'll do a bit of this, a bit of that, just sort of kind of give themselves a lovely looking CV with lots of different bits and pieces. And I didn't really feel like the focus, if I'm honest, was on like actually doing a really good job and really becoming an expert and then sticking around and fixing problems. I don't know. I mean, that's just anecdotal,
that's been a trend. I mean, when I first went in towards the end of the noughties, because it's such a big workforce, and it's not really a workforce, it's a sector. When you're talking about 500,000 people, you're talking about a sector, and every department's got its own culture and its own sort of identity. And actually, it used to be the case that every civil servant was on the same contract, that you were just a sort of officer of this, a home civil servant, and you were almost like, Churchill moving his troops around on the table. You were someone who had interdisciplinary range of administration, and you deployed your interdisciplinary range in various different ways to serve the government of the day. But then I think it was actually Margaret Thatcher who got rid of the central contract, because she was concerned about union behaviour that might take the whole apparatus of state out of function. So at that point, you when you keep asking why, you say, oh, that's why that happened, that's why that happened, that's why that happened, and that's why we're where we are today. But the trend in recent years, as the Institute for Government report shows, is because salaries are frozen, the only way you can, keep having more interesting and demanding jobs, manage bigger teams, progress your career is by moving around. And I'm the same as you. When I was in lobbying, I just found it really surprising that I was going along to kind of stakeholder groups, and I'd been in the job for not that long, but I had the most corporate memory in the room because the teams in the departments kept changing.
It also feels a little bit insulting, if I'm honest, to the people who really are, actually in these sectors, in these industries. So, for example, if there are people working in the Department of Agriculture who don't really know that much about farmers, the farmers are going to know that because the farmers know farming. And if suddenly this sort of, if there are, changes in policy, as I know there are this year, not that farming's my expertise at all, I'm slightly wishing I hadn't chosen this example, but, I could sort of see how it kind of gets on people's nerves, this idea that civil servants just sort of think they're so brilliant that they can just sort of job hop around from, health to agriculture to justice to whatever, because they're so amazing that, how hard can it be? And it's just like, I just don't know if that's a great look, if I'm honest, to people that really care about the industry they've worked in for their whole life. Completely. And they know inside out.
And that was, to his great credit, that was the Michael Gove speech in 2020 that sort of led to the commitment of the campus for government learning and the leadership college, and essentially the role I went into the cabinet office to do. recognised this point of we need more competence and domain knowledge in the civil service. And I think one of the benefits I had of starting outside was that I wasn't nervous about having conversations with people who were experts in their field, because I don't, my instinct was always to look outwards and talk to people. If there's a challenge, or a policy challenge, well, you're not the expert, but the kind of expertise you have is being able to find the expert. And I know exactly what you mean. There is nothing worse than those sort of stakeholder consultations where you just feel like it's almost better not to ask people at all if you're just asking them in a kind of performative manner. But I do think, and I'm going to try and say this in the least insulting way possible, I think we all know that the people who are most difficult to work with and the organisational cultures that are most challenging are this sort of strange combination of a superficial level arrogance, but very close to the service insecurity. And I think that one of the challenges of the civil service that Chris Wormold as incoming cabinet secretary needs to think about is so if you're a policy civil servant, that's about 40,000 people identify as policy professionals, and as you say, they're at worst kind of caricature, they're the people who are kind of moving between departments saying I'm a generalist, I can deploy my kind of generalist skills to anything. I often sort of thought, if a minister said, what does a policy professional actually know? Can I expect them to know the basics of the domain they're working in? Can I expect them to know how much, if they're working in education, how much does a teacher get paid? How does money move through the system? How do you run a school? The bit of history of that policy. Can they do a basic costings exercise? And I'm afraid in too many cases, the answer is no, none of those things. And I suppose, linking back to our earlier conversation, that's what you'd want in a serious HR credential, wouldn't you? You'd want to say, okay, you've got a license to operate in the business function that is HR. What is it that I know you can do? Can I guarantee you know employment law? Can I guarantee that you are able to, run a really excellent recruitment process? Can I guarantee that you can help me performance manage someone in a dignified and and swift way? And that's just not the case in the civil service. I don't know about other organisations, but you ask 10 different HR business managers what their advice on a certain issue is, and you'd get 10 different responses. Only HMRC, Majesty's Revenue and Customs, were able to accurately calculate the recruitment costs per hire of their staff. And I think it was something like only 1 in 16 departments were able to identify how many of their staff were underperforming. Well, to anyone in the private sector, that's an amazing kind of statistic, isn't it? But one thing that might be useful to say is that all the think tank reports and commentary on civil service reform over the last, probably 5 years, maybe even 10 years, have all basically said there's a sort of there's a closed shop. We need to have open recruitment for all roles. And I'm an example of someone who's quite happily moved in and out of the civil service, but the ability to recruit externally for expertise, it happened in times of crisis. So Kate Bingham in the Vaccines Task Force, there was someone brilliant who came in from Tesco's because they really knew supply chains, and supply chains were really important during that period. But they're the exception rather than the rule.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And is the civil service too big, or do you think that's not necessarily the problem?
And I definitely think it could, if it was better, if all those problems that we've mentioned are dealt with, it could and should be a lot smaller. That's a very civil servant way to answer that question. As a proportion of the employed people in the country, it's really massive compared to what it used to be. But I suppose the counter argument to that is modern government is just harder and harder and harder and more complicated, and the kind of the gulf between public expectations of what the government does for them, the expectations have increased and increased and increased. So there is a counter argument that, well, of course, the state is just going to keep getting bigger if people's expectations keep getting bigger. But I think this productivity point, the fact that public sector productivity is below what it was in 1997, and this we've got a bigger wage bill, but less experienced and expert people who don't have domain expertise and have been promoted, very, very quickly through their careers. That, again, it's, there are questions to ask there, aren't there?
So you're painting the picture of a whole load of people who aren't totally qualified or experienced enough to be doing the jobs that they're in, which is not brilliant.
And I really don't want to do that, Tanya, because as I say, I've just been very, very lucky through my career to work with. I mean, it's almost sort of, in spite of all these things, the civil service still attracts some of the most brilliant public servants, and they kind of achieve things in spite of, this is, I love that John Boyd phrase, people, ideas, technology, in that order. It is all about the people, and the fact that the system and all these constraints that are acting against getting things done in a big, complicated bureaucracy, the fact that we're still, in my more optimistic Pollyanna days, I look around just thinking it's a blooming miracle that anything's getting done. But it's because of just like people working really, really, really hard to overcome some of these problems. But as I say, I want this institution to be better.
Yeah.
And I want it to be excellent. And I think that's one of the things that is just to link back to your point about, is there a sort of dominant ideology in the people who are choosing HR careers now? And one of the things that I found quite puzzling, and it's particularly puzzling when you go to other countries like Singapore. I know the Civil Service College in Singapore quite well. I had conversations in civil service HR in the Cabinet Office, and again, I don't know whether this is true of, different HR teams across government who are, dealing with big industrial workforces. Maybe they will just roll their eyes as, this is a decadent conversation to be having. But can we talk about people being excellent? Is that not really offensive to people who aren't excellent? That sort of thing. Come on. We can all.
Yeah, I'm with you on that one.
I think the really interesting, philosophical kind of conversation to have about what's going on with HR at the moment is all. Do you know Jonathan Haidt, the guy who's written the brilliant stuff on smartphones at the moment? But his book, The Righteous Mind, is one of my absolute favourites. He talks about his moral foundations framework that he has, developed. He talks about where you are on a spectrum of things like fair and unfair, and how high you prioritise a sense of compassion and care over a sense of authority and tradition and things like that. And they're all very deliberately framed to not be any of these things as a desirable virtue. It's just where you are in the spectrum. And I think that as soon as I read that book, I started to sort of put people, when I'm having conversations with people, think, that's why we're not quite agreeing, because I think you must place a higher priority on that virtue rather than this virtue. And my overwhelming sense in HR conversations in the civil service was their definition of fairness was closer to an equality of outcome one. The only way to be fair is to make everyone have exactly the same experience and outcome, as I say, and that sort of goes against an institution that is, that depends on, as most institutions do, meritocracy, meritocratic progression, really earned hierarchy. If you fundamentally question that, the idea of a meritocracy being, maybe not perfect but a desirable thing, and hierarchy being when it is earned, when it is visible, transparent, when there's equality of opportunity, if you fundamentally question that, then you've got a very different role in the organisation, and I really noticed that in HR.
That sounds like a culture issue. Do you think all of this stuff is more to do with sort of institutional culture than it is to do with any specific problem with talent pipeline, people coming into the institutions and or leadership? I'm trying to look at both ends, whether it's kind of entry level talent coming in, or whether it's I mean, it sounds to me like a training issue as well, that you're describing training and development. But all this could this not all be sorted out if we had better leaders in place to kind of knock people into shape a little bit better?
As I said, I definitely think that one of the reasons for talking about this and wanting to have a conversation with this is to encourage leaders outside HR to be more curious about what's going on, to get more involved in what's being done and spent, in their name. Because at worst, I do think there's been a bit of a sort of dereliction of duty in terms of sort of saying, oh, well, the trends and the fads seem to be around, all this DEI stuff. I'm paraphrasing, a sort of unfair archetype kind of CEO. We've got all this stuff going on DEI. I'm a bit scared of it. I don't want to get cancelled. I'm just going to let my HR team do it. They seem to be really keen on this sort of stuff, and they've got kind of loads of new recruits who are really keen on this stuff. So you go off and do it, and then do the website boilerplate and like whatever you need to do the campaigns, do the awareness days, and not thinking that that's had an impact on well, you've just given people the incentive to do something that might be counter to your business objectives, to spend money without any proof of impact. And then, I mean, you can see this in the sort of the speed at which organizations have just got rid of all those functions. We're seeing it in the US, but we're also seeing it here. I think you posted about it. It just sort of, it's almost kind of, I mean, it's breathtakingly shameless in the speed at which people have said, oh, all that stuff we pretended to care about. Yeah, nonsense. I mean, it's shocking, really, isn't it?
Yeah. What I'm hoping is that they'll get rid of the performative stuff, which I'm not sure they were ever bought into. But I think, what Neil Morrison said in that interview, Neil Morrison from Severn Trent, in that previous episodes I've done, I think it was 6, 7 and 8, that what we're calling DEI actually covers a huge number of things, and some of them are really good. So there's babies in bathwater. And if we dump the stuff that wasn't doing anything anyway, it was getting on people's nerves and creating problems for us, that's fine. And keep the good stuff. We don't even need to call it DEI. It's just good policy. It's a way of recruiting good people. It's a way of hanging on to good people. It's a way of keeping the peace, and everyone's happy. Then happy days. Maybe we just don't. Maybe it doesn't even need a name. Maybe it's just like being a good employer.
Well, it's leadership, isn't it? It's leadership and management. I mean, that was when I first sort of went into the Cabinet Office job, and we were looking at how much was being spent on training, and which training courses were actually kind of, useful, proven, whatever they were. I found, I finally get the sort of list of companies that are being paid to deliver, lunchtime seminars. And I found these 2 menopause organisations that were delivering, webinars on the menopause in the Cabinet Office. And I looked them up on Companies House because I'm that kind of nerd. And they've both been set up in the last year. PLCs. And I sort of thought, someone's just said, oh, menopause, that's a thing. Davina McCall's talking about it. But when you actually sort of look at what's being said in these things, have a good relationship with your manager. Like, every individual experience is different. And, I just feel like I've fought all my career to not be kind of categorized within some sort of shared experience of an accident of birth. And yes, there's things you need to do because you have there are still honest to God issues of sexism, and racism, and things that need to be properly addressed. And actually, I think as a country and as a civil service, we've got better and better at doing so. But the some of the sort of niche performative stuff that was being done was just indulgent and unproven.
Yeah, I don't. I mean, you won't get any disagreement from me on that stuff. You might get some from some people listening to this, but I don't know. This podcast tends to attract fairly sensible people who are willing to admit that some mistakes have been made here, and maybe we need to look at correcting things and being better.
Well, if they've made it this far, they must be interesting.
They're hanging in. Thank you guys for listening. Okay, so we're kind of moving on, aren't we, to talking about DEI, the dreaded DEI. Lots of obviously change in this area. the civil service seems to have gone pretty big on DEI pretty early, for which there may well be historical reasons that possibly some organisations targeted the civil service, realising it was a really important one to kind of get involved with various agendas. But I think it's really good to think about some of the cases that we've seen coming to the surface here.
I started Civic Future with Munira Mirza, the CEO, a couple of years ago. I'm quite a long time out of it now. I'm following it like an interested viewer, as I presume many of your listeners and networks are. The story that's been in the papers this week of Eleanor Francis, I don't know her, but anyone who's sort of saying, oh, there isn't a problem here, just, move along, only needs to read about that case to realise that there is something odd going on. All I'd say is, and this was one of the conclusions of the Inclusion at Work panel and one of the reasons why we were asked to do what we did, I genuinely don't think this is unique to the civil service, this issue. It's because of the nature of the civil service, the size of it, the sort of the vagaries of the workforce that we've discussed. Things are seen in high definition and sharp relief there, and the scale is greater. And definitely the sort of public sector equality duty aspect of the Equality Act has had a real impact, I think, on the way people are behaving, and particularly the kind of chilling sort of impact it's had in. And I think the Maya Forstater case has, proved that. And many cases and sort of discussions since have talked about this. What people have been doing, thinking that they are in pursuit of complying with the law, but actually in doing so far exceeding the law. That I think that possibly, I don't know this, I think it's possibly more dominant in the civil service and public sector than in the private sector. But as we've just been saying about, the speed by which, or a lot of private sector organisations have, got rid of their whole DEI team, because the vibe has changed, as people are saying, the vibe shift. The fact they had them in the first place, right. so the quick to adopt, quick to get rid of. I think it's more evident in the private sector.
Yeah, I guess the concern with the civil service is that if you've got people in these roles that are supposed to be independent, and if in fact they're not, and they're supposed to be carrying out duties, which require them to be independent, then that's a problem. There was a speech actually. I assume you know Baroness Fox, Claire Fox, who did a quite a punchy speech in the House of Lords back in November. I'm going to read it out actually, because I think, a little bit of it, because I think it's she doesn't mince her words, Baroness Fox, but I think this sort of shows some of the resentment that's building. So she says, "My lords, we all remember senior civil servants openly in tears the morning after the Brexit vote, or the civil service union threatening to go on strike over the Rwanda scheme. These are troubling examples of a politicised civil service, but I will focus on a more insidious trend that is in denial." Then she goes on to say, "The civil service is drowning in an identity and diversity groupthink. However, there's an obstinate refusal to acknowledge that a particular outlook on, for example, gender or race, is political at all, let alone that it could compromise impartiality. It is hiding in plain sight." So her point is that if you've got people in these roles who are not independent, then she's worried that they're not seeking out properly diverse perspectives. So she mentions Kemi Badenoch, when she was looking for information about the Tavistock clinic, that she seemed to have been sort of steered away from looking too deeply into that issue. So she says the civil servants were not being malign, but their worldview is so narrowly focused that they could not conceive of why anyone would want to hear counter narratives as well. So I think that underscores why it's so important, doesn't it? Roles.
I know Claire, and I love listening to her speak. I don't always agree with her, but she's always sort of goes to first principles to make her arguments. And on that point, I recognise what she's talking about. And that, do you know that organisation More in Common? I think if you did a More in Common survey of certainly the kind of civil service that works with ministers. So, you know, the 80, 90,000 people in and are giving direct advice to ministers. I suspect that would be majority progressive activist in the more in common terms. That would be because, you know, this is a graduate workforce, particularly a humanities graduate workforce, a London dwelling workforce. I mean, you only have to look at the sort of the demographics of that to be able to map on views. Where it became really problematic, and sorry, I hate using that word, it's such a sort of loaded phrase now, isn't it? But where it was a problem in terms of an impartial institution, and where I and many others, in fact, started to say, hang on a minute, can we just reread the Armstrong Memorandum about what we're here to do, is where people sort of assumed, because they were progressive activists and all their friends were progressive activists in terms of this segmentation of more in common, they were, if every workforce was a normal distribution curve, we've just got the common view of at the center. You know, it's you that's being extreme. You know, you're the outlier. We're the you know, you're the ideologue. We're just the center. And I used to sort of use examples. You know, reading lists would go round, and it was particularly, I don't know whether you've listened to that absolutely brilliant podcast. What's it called? The Witch Trials of J.K. Rowling. And yes. What I loved about it was there was definitely a link between people going slightly crazy during COVID, and then there was the George Floyd death in the States, and we were all watching it, on social media. So I do think that podcast really explains what was also going on in the civil service around, you know, reading lists flying around with, you know, white fragility and I've stopped talking to white people about race, all those sorts of books. You know, I've read many of them, interesting sociological kinds of comment, but they're equally as interesting as Douglas Murray's books, as Eric Kaufman's books. And the point is that during that period, it was okay to send a reading list round with a certain set of books, but it wasn't okay to send a reading list round about another set of books. And that's just weird in an organisation that's impartial and that should be tolerant. And that, you know, all the stuff about bringing your whole self to work, I'm really good. These things are just, I mean, Neil's right. These things are just fads, and we'll move on to the next thing.
But I think it's been quite a damaging fad because it's such a big idea. And bring your whole self to work sounds like just a little sort of throwaway line.
No, but it's
a hell of a big idea.
It's a hell of a big idea, and also it wasn't true, was it? Because they didn't mean it if you were a social conservative or pro-life or a very devout Catholic or Muslim. Like you just don't bring your whole self to work. Thank you very much.
Yes, I know it's not been our best moment. That's for sure. I think particularly it seems like from the outside, the civil service seems to have issues with issues with gender critical staff. I think it was the first of the SEEN networks. I think it stands for Sex Equity and Equality Networks, which are these
they've been heroic.
Well, so those are groups that I think they are kind of designed to be sort of almost like support groups for people with gender critical views in certain industries. It's not per organisation, it's per industry. And just people kind of coming together and saying, hang on a minute, I'm not necessarily on board with all this stuff about gender identity, but I kind of want to get along with my colleagues, but I don't want to feel like I've got to go along with stuff I don't believe in. So these networks have sprung up. And actually, I believe the first one was the civil service one. I don't think it was even called SEEN in the civil service at the time. I think it was just the SEEN network. And the fact that I guess that was the first one, I mean, I guess, it's so big that maybe that's why it was the first. But it almost looks like it was the first because it was possibly the worst there. The culture was the worst. So I don't know. You could take from that what you will. I know they've had lots of problems when they were setting up, compared with presumably no problems setting up the LGBT network. So that's, and they're sort of shrouded in secrecy, and there's been objections from people who are calling them transphobic and all this sort of stuff. So I think that's a kind of indicator that something's not right there. And then most recently, there was an engineer called Eleanor Francis who I think she just got it was $100,000 payout actually recently. It's good because she claimed that an internal document, it was a policy, the gender identity and intersex policy was adopted without proper consultation following workplace assessment by Stonewall, who are LGBT rights lobby group in the UK. And she said the policy's use of politicised language and concepts, for example, defining transphobia as including the denial or refusal to accept someone's gender identity, meant that civil servants were effectively compelled to recognise male people as women. That's what it says. This is actually from the Telegraph. So, and she brought a case against the Department for Culture, Media and Sport and the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology for victimisation. I think she ended up leaving the civil service, but she won that case. And yes, there was a payout of £116,000. So, and I think the idea now is that the civil service is going to go back and look at all their policies around this and correct mistakes which are in them, which I think would be a good thing, to try and get that balance back, to say, look, some people believe in this, some people believe in this, and we all have to work together. And there isn't really a situation where it's appropriate to say this organisation, this institution has a certain political view. It's not appropriate in the private sector, but it's really not appropriate in any sort of public sector institution. I think that's what we're moving towards, and I think that would be a welcome return.
Absolutely.
What do you think?
No, absolutely, and I'd urge anyone to follow that case and closely in some of the commentary about it, because it's very revealing. As one thing that I hope and actually expect, and it seems to be a consequence of what's happening, is that it's the senior leaders, the permanent secretaries, the non-HR leaders are taking back control. And that, again, going back to why I wanted to, think about this and write the piece I did, is I just think that taking back control of some of these issues by the people who are responsible for their workforce and their workforce culture, I think for too long a period, people have, for whatever reason, and I think some of it is kind of slight fear, because it's been such a sort of volatile and sensitive debate around some of these issues of, inclusion and diversity, that senior leaders of government departments have sort of said, well, I'll leave it to the experts to deal with this. But then, the question, can anyone be an expert in this very new and sort of evolving debate? And is it are the HR people right to lead this? So as a sort of if this is a moment when senior leaders and managers are taking more responsibility for some of these issues, that is a good thing. One of the reasons for Kemi Badenoch commissioning that Inclusion at Work panel was to do precisely what we've been discussing needed to be done, which was, can we just look at the range of things being done in pursuit of these unchallengeably laudable aims, or are they? Is our definition of diversity a shared one? Because actually, we can have a very cosmetically diverse organisation that has absolutely not cigarette paper between them in terms of worldview, which is, then they're not representative of society. But can we just look at the evidence around some of these things that are taking a lot of time, costing a lot of money? And that's what we did. I was asked to lead this panel, and I was always very clear about my, the other panelists had much more insight into equality and what worked and inclusion sort of interventions than I did. But we made the recommendation that a sort of investors in people like Mark was the worst possible thing you could do, because it would sort of solidify some of the entities and interventions that we were a bit dubious about the evidence around. So we spoke to loads and loads of people. We saw that everyone was ultimately seeking the same aim. That people were a bit nervous about talking about this. That behind all the different kind of attempts to increasingly sort of segment us into further and further smaller identities, were the same arguments around good management, being empathetic, understanding people's individual needs, all of those sorts of things. So our recommendations, I mean, you've talked about them at length on this podcast. I don't know whether the new government's taken them. There's certainly, the new government's not going to say, well, I'll do exactly what Kemi Badenoch wanted to do. But, I think the smoke signal seemed to be that this was a sensible shift in what was happening. And, I think people are thinking a bit harder about what they spend on things.
I think moving towards a more evidence-based, healthier work environment where properly diverse, views can be expressed, and we have a good diversity of people there in the room, that just feels like a much healthier place to be. I can't see us going for a sort of Donald Trump style bonfire of DEI roles. I think we're a little bit more measured in the UK, and I think obviously there's a left-wing government in at the moment in the UK anyway. But I can't really see it. I don't actually even see that in the private sector. I think they'll bin the stuff that was performative and getting on people's nerves anyway, and they'll keep the good stuff.
Exactly.
I think it's all about babies and bathwaters.
There's more people like Neil around who'll just sort of very quietly just carry on doing what works and sort of stop some of the stuff that doesn't.
Yeah, I really recommend everyone listens to the Neil Morrison episodes, because he is the voice of reason. We want to have him on again soon. So listen, I want to thank you so much for your time, Pamela, but also for being willing to kick the hornet's nest. I think it's a really important role. I know you didn't intend to kind of, stir up any sort of trouble or whatever, but I think maybe it's just kind of collateral damage in the process of getting to where we need to be. And as you say, striving for kind of higher standards and can we do things better? Ultimately, I think we all want the same thing. So let's hope we can move forward in a kind of healthier way from here. And
what a nice note to end on. Yeah. And,
yes.
I love hearing from anyone who is as curious about this as I am. So
wonderful. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you. Really appreciate it. Thank you.